Thank you very much, Michael. So, today's talk is a keynote, and my idea is to paint a broad picture of what's going on. For context, I'm from Ireland. I live in Japan. I've been working around open source governance for around 20 years. My focus is usually on intellectual property, and that means my focus tends to be on the monetization or non-monetization choices that we make around something like software. So my talk is going to be very practical. I'm going to focus on corporate use of open source. I'm not going to talk about philosophy or abstracts. This is about how businesses use and make money from this particular approach to software. Now, when we talk about open source in 2023, things are getting complex. We used to be in a simpler world. There was less code, and what we had to do around the code was less complex as well. One of the main things that's notable recently is that there are more rules and guidelines that are impacting or will impact open source software. The NTIA minimum requirements of software bill of materials and the White House executive order from our friends in North America have put software bill of materials, SBOM, at the forefront of commercial open source use. In fact, all software use. Suddenly, our supply chains are under a lot of pressure to have adequate tagging and communication of the information about software. Quite frankly, we haven't done a good job of that in the past, so it's probably overdue, but there's quite a lot of pressure to get it done right now, and that impacts us when we're dealing with so many thousands of software components. We also have the Cyber Resiliency Act in the European Union, which is essentially suggesting that there should be dramatically increased reporting and compliance requirements. This means that the pressure on open source to move from what had been still relatively ad hoc uses and approaches into structured approaches has dramatically increased. There are good reasons for this. For instance, in the Cyber Resiliency Act, in the explanatory materials, there's a note that the global cost of cybercrime is 5.5 trillion per year. So there's huge amounts of money, there's significant reasons to get things more organized and structured, even if some of the approaches that are proposed might not be our favorites. And in open source, we need to do better. We need to have far more support for software bill of materials. This is an inevitability. The support is growing. A week or two ago, GitHub made a way to do one-click SBOM tagging and export from your GitHub hosted projects. Tooling is getting better and awareness is getting better. However, we still have a lot to do regarding tooling and record keeping in companies and projects. And that means we need to have more coordination, particularly coordination around standards, so we're all following the same rules. Now, when it comes to essentially the second topic around something like CRA, the Cyber Resiliency Act, enhanced reporting and other compliance requirements are still to be determined. There's a carve-out to reduce the weight of these on open source to deal with the fact that a nonprofit open source project might not be able to do the same sort of reporting as a global multinational. The language is still not perfect, the stuff is draft, that reporting and compliance is still to be determined. But we can say the SBOM thing is locked in, we have to get that done. Enhanced reporting and compliance. Let's see, definitely something is coming. We'll have to do something. Now, why is a very simple question and answer. Why this is happening is that we have an idea of the supply chain working in a certain way, which is structured, and the actual supply chain is a spaghetti monster of chaos. So everything is broken, and the data is dire. We have over 67% of people managing their supply chains in Excel. We have 94% of companies who don't have full visibility in their supply chain, which is a polite way of saying they have no idea what's going on. And this is strange because what we have on data and what companies say is that they want the supply chain to work well. We know that there's a lot of cost savings with optimization in the supply chain. We know that companies see supply chain management as a competitive edge, and companies see it as a driver for customer service. We're just not executing very well. Uh, Pulling back, what is clear, regardless of how well we execute or do not execute, is that managing the supply chain better is important. And certainly open source license compliance and security assurance are a key part of supply chain management. If you're looking at a chaotic supply chain and you're looking at open source and you're thinking, what two things do we definitely want to improve? License compliance, so you actually have the right to move the software, obviously, and security, so that you're not leaking information or causing chaos for yourself and your customers. So these are key parts of improving that supply chain mix. And the data is clear. First of all, so many code bases are using open source that we have to get this right as soon as possible. Second of all, if we acknowledge license compliance and security are important, the data is very dire on how well we're doing. Over half of code bases have compliance issues. Over 80% have security issues. We're still not doing well enough in these areas. So, long story short, we're definitely looking at a situation where open source in 2023 is seeing external factors putting pressure on it regarding things like software bill of materials, enhanced compliance and reporting. We're seeing a reality where the supply chain is a bit of a mess, and open source in the supply chain is a bit of a mess, including on the very critical areas. Now, all is not grim. We are doing better in the supply chain. We are facing many challenges, but we are improving our processes, and we've seen a lot of improvement in the last 5 years compared to where we were before. The most important thing to keep in mind is that for improving how open source operates, if we're responding to the market pressure in 2023, the key thing we have to think about in 2023 is processes, processes, processes. One example on this slide I have is that before you can have an SBOM implemented, you need to have a policy and processes to support that implementation. So we know that in open source, we have to take a certain approach, and the truth is that we're already doing a lot with it. So pulling out from the project I lead, OpenChain, we have seen significant advances in open source process management on license compliance and security. We have an ISO standard for open source license compliance and a draft ISO standard for security assurance. Both of these standards are high-level process documents, and the idea is that they're very simple baseline processes to have a quality either license compliance or security assurance program in place. And they're responsive in a very practical way to the market pressures I highlighted earlier. And of course, I should note that these are open standards developed in the same way as open source software. You turn up on the calls, you join the mailing list, you write the standards with the community. In case you're not familiar with them, these standards work in a very simple way. Company by company, they ask a company to have inbound, internal, and outbound processes, with a particular emphasis on, of course, identifying what software is in play, but having training and policy to make sure the company is resilient. And then as more and more companies use the same standards across the supply chain, everything gets more predictable. This is all nuanced and, quite frankly, quite boring stuff, but it is responding to where we are in the market and the increasing pressures that we see. Lots of companies are already using these standards. For example, on the screen are some that announced through the project website. and more are continually appearing. Today I will be announcing ByteDance, that's the company behind TikTok, is now using the ISO standard for open source license compliance. But the important thing is probably that when we do deeper marker metrics, we're seeing the industry coalescing around these standards. So PwC sponsored the Bitkom open source monitor survey in 2021. And for the companies they surveyed in Germany, 20% with more than 2,000 employees, so any company with more than 2,000 employees, 20% of those were already using the ISO standard for open source license compliance. So to summarize where we are right now, the state of open source is that we're seeing increased formalization, specific market pressures, open source is responding to them, and we're seeing good traction in that response in places like Germany and elsewhere, of course. I mentioned ByteDance just became OpenChain conformant. It's a Chinese company. Just in the last few weeks, we've seen companies like Alibaba Cloud, China Mobile also announce that they're using ISO standards for open source compliance. So the market response is looking solid. Companies behind stuff like this, companies underwriting this transformation, OpenChain has these 24 in play. And as you can see, some are German, some are American, some are Chinese, some are Japanese, etc. Basically, a very diverse set of stakeholders have recognized where we are in open source, what's going on, and how to respond to it. More importantly is the fact that in open source, the entire global community is doing the same. In OpenChain alone, there's the massive global community of response of people engaging with these topics. And it's not just open source license compliance and open source security. They're also responding to adjacent topics about, given where open source is, given what we're seeing with market pressures to essentially have better regulation, management, structure, compliance, reporting, what other stuff do we need? And whether it's tooling, whether it's thinking about industry specific like automotive and telco, thinking about public policy engagement to deal with government communication, thinking about export control, they're organically doing that. And you can go to places like the OpenChain project to engage and work with them. Now, just pulling out an example from the OpenChain standards, but remember this applies to other standards in play. For instance, there are standards for software bill of materials like SPDX. There are standards for other topics. With OpenChain, you can have things like self-certification, independent assessment, and third-party certification. The same applies to other standards unless they explicitly say, no, you can't do that, you can only do third-party certification. And when it's open chain, as an example, when it's open source specific, in general, there's a trend to make it as easy as possible. And things like self-certification material is often published freely so that not just companies, but also projects can quickly go and see if I want to improve my response to the current market pressures, I want to have better processes, they can have a quick checklist to get that done. And on the more formal side, if you're looking for things like third-party certifiers, go back 8 years. There's no third-party certifiers specializing in certifying you on OpenChain standards, on processes, or software bill of material, because those standards didn't exist in areas like ISO. Now they do. There's third-party certifiers, and if needed, they can go and help you do your adoption of standards, whether it's process standards, software bill of material, or whatever. Tons of other things like training courses, other material helping with this market response. And everyone can go to places like OpenChain Project and get involved. There's no fee or any restrictions on participation. Pulling back and concluding then, we're going right back to the beginning. The fact is that the state of open source in 2023 can be summarized as open source is growing up. We're seeing regulation hitting this market. We're seeing a situation where structures are needed. That's the most important thing that's happening. So regulation and compliance has increased, and corporate use of open source is facing a lot of pressure this year and will face more pressure for structured management. So the state of open source is that we are growing up. The good news is that we have the right approaches for that. We have standards, processes, we have methods for dealing with the increased emphasis. And projects like OpenChain, other projects can deal with this more structured corporate environment, and things are looking good. But we do have a lot of improvement to make. There's still a lot of work to fix our supply chains. And that's it. Thank you very much indeed. Someone in the chat said it sounds like marketing for Microsoft or Red Hat. To me, compliance is one of the reasons why software is badly written. We don't take care of software quality because we processes to show it's not our fault. Then there's a comment, I doubt 5.5 trillion is related to open source, and so on. And ends with, I'm not saying that we shouldn't do better, but I'm saying we shouldn't make the same errors and start to take on start take care of software quality rather than time to market or something similar. You're wrong on every point. Let me explain why. You're thinking of this from a functional perspective, and you're conflating the motives of a handful of service providers with the market imperative of go-to-market. The only reason a company is doing software is to make money. Any company that's not making money is not a company. Software is a tool, and the product is a tool. A car company is not a car company. It's a mechanism to make money implemented through the delivery of cars and nowadays adjacent services. Open source is not a special and unique flower. It's just software, which is just a tool to bring a product to market which generates money. The fact is, for a company, your biggest challenge is to go from, we know there's an opportunity to deliver to market, and we've executed on this opportunity. The question is, how do you make the execution as efficient as possible? Something like dealing with compliance is essential. You have to have compliance on something like intellectual property if you're using third-party intellectual property to get to market. Something like security compliance is essential because in the past you didn't need to do it so much. There wasn't that much punishment, maybe a bad news article or two. But nowadays there's real fiscal costs to lack of security. You can be hit with enormous fines. So as a corporate entity thinking, how do I deliver into a market gap something that I can sell and generate revenue? As part of that mechanism, you have to address things like, okay, I'm using third-party code. I need to address licenses to be able to use that third-party code. Or I'm doing something that contains information or data protection that could get me in huge trouble if it's wrong. These are simply the facts of execution. And suggesting that process management is a way to escape loopholes, or suggesting that because not all of the cybercrime cost is open source, you don't have to think about cybercrime as a serious motive for increasing regulation, is putting a functional approach to considering software as a technical issue ahead of the fact that that's not how markets operate. It's not why businesses are here, and it's not how and why governments make laws. And we're talking about corporate use of open source, so we're talking about how the market operates and what laws are in place. You have to match the requirements of these realities. And your concern about code quality is a completely different topic. It's an engineering topic. And that's very separate from the question on a business strategy sense. What do we need to go to market? And suggesting that it's marketing for Microsoft or Red Hat, I'd have to respond, why on earth would that be the case? You don't purchase from someone unless you have to. You don't introduce a cost center and hire someone like Red Hat and their support mechanism unless you have to. If you're able to do it in-house, if you can have alternative providers, then you should do so. You make informed choices. What's the minimum cost for the maximum result on this problem domain? So I'd suggest then that it's important to never confuse the functional implementation of software with the imperatives of business process management and why businesses are operating. Of course, as well as regulations, they should have good quality software, but it's not the same problem.